Welcome to the Bible channel. In this video, the first of 3, we address the subject, Titus, setting the Ecclesia in order. Study 1, Paul and Titus travel to Crete and beyond. Dive deep into the Book of Titus with this eye-opening Bible study. We explore Paul and Titus's journey to Crete and uncover timeless lessons on church leadership, sound doctrine, and godly living. Whether you're a Bible scholar or just starting your faith journey, this study will inspire and challenge you to live a life that honors God. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more life-changing Bible studies. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. We would love to hear from you.
What a marvellous topic we've got to look at. I really got to say that I looked at Titus, of course, over the years, but haven't really given any in-depth study on it, and it's fantastic. It really is. It's so applicable to our world today. You read about the Cretans. Did you just read that? It says, what's it say? Always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies, and it's true. And it's in the Ecclesia. That's the world of the Cretans. And part of the reason was that nobody had given them any leadership. As a matter of fact, the Cretans didn't like leadership. They didn't like authority. They didn't like discipline. They weren't really keen on things being set in order. And that was the society. That was the kind of people they were. And you know, there were ecclesias in possibly 100 cities in Crete. Because the Apostle Paul says, appoint elders in every city. That's what we just read in chapter 1. And historians tell us, Homer tells us, and that's long before the Apostle Paul, that Crete was the isle of 100 cities. That's a lot of ecclesias, isn't it? Had a population of anywhere between 300,000 and 600,000 people in Paul's day. There's about 600,000 people live there today. And if there's 100 ecclesias, well, that's 30 in an ecclesia. Well, if they lived in houses, that would be right, wouldn't it? 30 to 60 people in an ecclesia, on average. Some big cities, some smaller cities. But the Apostle Paul hadn't spent much time there early on. But now, just before he writes this letter, he spends quite a bit of time there. And then he leaves. Could I almost call him Paul's hero? Titus, there to look after the ecclesias, to reinforce the kind of arrangements the Apostle Paul said needed to be put in place, to deal with people who needed to be dealt with, and to set the foundations. Does anybody know whether there are any Christadelphians in Crete today? I'm not aware of any. The environment, the society in that island, ever since history began, has never really been conducive to growth of the truth. But the Apostle Paul did everything he possibly could. And Titus did everything he possibly could to set those ecclesias on the best foundation that was possible. What we're going to be talking about is the context of this letter, so we can really get a feel for what was going on, why the Apostle wrote this letter, why he aimed it at the subjects that he aimed it at, why Crete was the right place for the right person, that is Titus, to carry on for some time and consolidate what the Apostle Paul began, and what had been begun a long time before as well. So we need to look at Crete. We need to look at its history to some extent. We could say its culture, its geography, the kind of people that were there. You know, when you really look at it around the world, demographics is a very, very important thing. Demographics is to do with the type of people, the kind of culture that lives in a certain place, a certain environment, a certain environment with different weather patterns, distances from other countries or settlements or civilizations, how that affects the behaviour of the people and the kind of people that dwell there. In this island, the kind of culture was all about independence. They were one of the biggest islands in Crete in the Mediterranean Sea. They were fairly equidistant from Greece and Egypt and the Mediterranean coast, Israel, Canaan. They grew independent. They were obviously, a lot of ships would go through there, so they traded quite a bit. They were settled, first of all, by the Egyptians, and later on by the Greeks, the sons of Javan, settled some of the islands, so they were a bit multicultural. Egypt, sons of Ham, Javan, sons of Japheth, and they mingled together there. From them came, actually from the Egyptians, came the Philistines. All right? And the Philistines migrated from, they were amongst those who migrated out of Egypt to settle that island, and then, in due course, they moved across to the coast of Canaan. That's the Philistines. So they're a mixed bag. They are a fairly fierce group of characters. And we're going to see that, and see that the Apostle Paul, when he's writing to this ecclesia, has to deal with cultural factors as well as integration by the Judaizers into the ecclesia, and lots of Hellenistic or Greek influences there as well. So there's quite a lot involved in this ecclesia. You know, it's quite a different kind of ecclesia. It's not homogeneous at all. And so there's a lot to be set in order. Now, the pastoral letters, as they're called, the letters that Paul wrote to Timothy, to Titus, and to, how do you say it, Philemon, Philemon. There are all sorts of different ways of saying it, I think. Philemon, Philemon. Okay, I'll say Philemon. I like that. But anyway, we'll stick with that. So you've got 4 letters there that the Apostle Paul wrote to individuals to encourage them personally. Different circumstances, of course. Which one do you think was the first of those that was written, of those 4? Any ideas? Let's go Philemon. Okay, Philemon first. It's written while Paul's in prison, the first occasion, and it's written to Philemon, whose runaway slave Onesimus had come to Paul in Rome and had been baptised by Paul, and Paul is sending him back to Philemon. Philemon lived in Laodicea, and there's a reference in Colossians to the epistle to the Laodiceans. Now that's not Revelation chapter 3, that's the letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to Philemon's home in Laodicea. So he lived there with his family, and the ecclesia met in his home, and that was the basis of the Laodicean ecclesia later on. That's the first letter. And Paul, of course, encourages Philemon to accept Onesimus, his slave, back into the ecclesia, and no doubt that all happened. And Paul said, I'm coming to visit you, which he does, we'll see. What would be the second one that would have been written, do you think, of those 4? 1 Timothy, exactly, 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy, written to Timothy, where from Paul, who's saying, I've just come out of prison. I want you to stay in Ephesus. I'm on my way to see you. We'll work together. Timothy, in fact, had been in jail himself in that first imprisonment, or at least in the house arrest. Remember, Paul was in house arrest for 2 years in his own hired house, but he was a prisoner, a bond slave for Christ. And he writes to Timothy in Ephesus again with some similar factors to the letter to Titus, where it's a matter of setting the ecclesias to continue to operate effectively by being organised, and also behavioural factors as well. What would be the next letter? It has to be Titus. That's right, it has to be Titus. And Titus is written in the period between Paul being released from prison the first time and being taken back to prison the second time, or being captured in Rome and taken to prison, and ultimately, a few months later, to his death. So Titus, we'll talk about exactly where the context fits in a moment, but it's in between first and second imprisonments, and it's involving Paul and Titus in the work related to Crete. But we're going to see that they're involved in a lot of other work as well during that time that Paul was free and released. Because he says to Titus, later on in the epistle, he says, I want you to come to be with me during the winter time in Nicopolis, because there's work to be done from there. So he's left him in Crete, and he says, come to me after you've finished your work, and when I've sent another brother to help with the work there as well. So Titus, we said, pretty dramatic epistle. Lots of things going on in Crete that Titus has to deal with. Then the last one has to be 2 Timothy, doesn't it? 2 Timothy, where the Apostle Paul says, I'm now ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I've kept the faith. There's a crown of righteousness. Well, they're very, very encouraging letters. Every one of them. The Apostle Paul got a brilliant way of laying the law down, very gently, and encouraging, and building people up in the way that he writes these very, very personal letters. They're great for us to have a look at and to think about how they apply to us in our own lives, in our environment, in our ecclesial circumstances, and our behaviour amongst the world as well, our fellow men. Now, when did the truth first go to Crete? Well, let's go back to Acts chapter 2, because on the day of Pentecost, Cretans were there. All right, so we go to Acts chapter 2, and here are the people who hear in their own language. Now, there were many Greeks there, but there were people of other language too in Crete. They all heard in their own tongue, and people from as far as Rome heard it all in Latin. And Latin was the language which really embraced the whole of the rest of the empire on the western side. So from Rome, we know the Apostle Paul is instructed by the Lord Jesus Christ to go to the ends of the earth. We're going to see maybe how far the ends of the earth were that the Apostle Paul went to. And the strangers from Rome would have been the Latin speakers, and there were very many Latin speakers right across through Gaul, right throughout that Western Roman Empire. But in Acts chapter 2, verse 9, verse 8, how hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born? Parthians, that's Persians, and Medes, and Elamites, and all that area over there. Dwellers in Mesopotamia, and Judea, and Cappadocia, and Pontus, right up in northern Turkey, Asia, the area where the 7 ecclesias ended up, Asia Minor, Phrygia, Pamphylia, and Egypt, and parts of Libya about Cyrene, strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, and almost last of all, Greeks and Arabians. We do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God, and they're all amazed. Marvellous. So there's a picture of where they all came from. And there's Crete, right smack in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, with, as we said, well, let's say 500,000 at least people there, many Jews there, and of course the Jews were there wherever there was trade to be, getting away from Judea and the trouble with the Romans there. And in Crete they could almost be, as we said, somewhat independent. They weren't too much troubled by either the Romans or the Egyptians. They could more or less live their own life there in many respects. Anyway, the people from Crete who came to Jerusalem took the gospel back to Crete. Now, we don't hear about anybody else visiting them. It grew sort of organically, the ecclesias there, and grew right throughout the whole island, all the cities. And there were ecclesias everywhere. Quite amazing. Now, how big is Crete? To give you an idea how big the island of Crete is. One of the largest islands in the Mediterranean, about 140 miles long, 35 broad. Current population 620, as we said, 300 to 600,000, possibly 100 cities, and a multicultural society with a large Jewish presence. Has anybody ever looked at the map of southeast Queensland like sideways? Let's pretend you're on the shores of Moreton Bay and you're looking out at Moreton Island, and the island of Crete is just out there. All right, so there's the Gold Coast. There's Noosa up there. It's about 150 miles. And this island is 140 miles long. It's a big island, isn't it? It's a big island. So it gives you an idea. If you swam out there from Moreton Island, it's a big island. You could land anywhere. So it's to give an idea of the size. Now, here it is with showing the topography. The White Mountains here, Mount Ida there, and Mount Dicte there. So it's a lot of islands on the mountain. For that reason, there's not a lot of agriculture except in this valley of Masara here. Okay? And when the Apostle Paul came on the journey in which he was ultimately shipwrecked, they passed by Salmone to get some protector from the northwest winds that were blowing this way. Okay? So they passed down by Salmone and came underneath, and it's getting on to autumn by this time. And in autumn, they stopped at this port called the Fair Havens. And it's called the Fair Havens because it's a fair weather haven. For fair weather, quite a nice little port. Nearby, says Acts chapter 27, was the city of Ecclesia. And the ship, of course, and the master weren't sure whether to go ahead or not. The weather was closing in, winter wasn't far away. But they thought maybe we get across to Phoenix, or Phoenix as it's called now. Phoenix, there's a much better port there. It's protected by the White Mountains. We'll try and get there. Winter's closing in, remember. Now that valley, as we said, is really the source of all the agriculture between the middle and the eastern range of mountains. There's a big valley there, and it's lots of volcanic soil, and it grows. It's famous for its grapes and its olives. And the sad thing about the grapes situation was they turned into very fine wine. And you'll see the Apostle Paul says, hey, not too much wine. And it is a problem still in Crete today. They are. Anybody been to Mediterranean shore type areas? There's all sorts of cafes laid out, on the water's edge, and everybody's out there, and all the men are there. The women must be the ones that do the work. Because they're all there, actually they're drinking coffee in the morning, sipping wine in the afternoon, got their game boards out in front of them, and that's all they do. They just sit there all day, maybe have a chat, maybe move a chess piece or something. And that's the lazy lifestyle of the Mediterranean. And it was no different back then. They sold some of the grapes and the olives, of course, off to Europe as well. They had very little else they had other crops, they had nuts and things like that, a few sheep and goats, but that was their main produce. It was a very, very lazy lifestyle. Good volcanic soil, didn't have to do much to it, and it produced very, very well. Now here are the White Mountains where the Apostle Paul and his ship were heading towards. And incredible mountains, right down to the sea. 8,000 feet high as Kosciuszko, right close to the water, and they were protective from the winter winds. The winter winds came around from the northeast, and they tried to get to Venice to winter there, and then they would be heading off to Rome. This is of course, the Apostle Paul's journey as a prisoner towards Rome. So down they came past Salmone, about 59 AD, approximately. Maybe it was late 58, but 59 according to this particular suggestion. Down across to the Fair Havens, and what happened? Well, they tried to get across what's called the 12-mile gap. And that's the area between those mountains there where they're not protected from northerly winds. If they can get across the 12 miles gap, they'll be safe. They'll get to Venice and they can winter there under that mountain range. It did not happen, did it? It didn't happen. Because that valley of Masara is where the big wind comes down the valley. Euroclydon. Remember? Euroclydon. It comes whooshing down. drives them further south, down under they try and get some safety under that little island called Clauda. Doesn't work. They get pushed further. They're afraid they're going to fall into quicksands near there. They straight sail, it says, and whoosh, just let the wind take them 600 miles to the island of Melita or Malta. Incredible. Just blowing. 600 miles on the sea is a long, long way in a little sailing boat. Well, there's a couple hundred people on board, a few hundred people on board, but it's a pretty small ship. So up comes the tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. Tempestuous, Euroclydon, that great northeast wind that blows terribly in the winter time. The word tempestuous in the Greek is related to the name typhon. Any idea what that might relate to in English? Typhoon, might be. Typhoon. And this was the Greek god, fiercest god of all the Greek gods, the god of storms, fierce storms. Typhon, the god. Well, of course, they were all fearful and calling out to their gods until the Apostle Paul said, calm down. The angel of God has spoken to me this night and it'll be all right. Well, so that was the first visit of the Apostle Paul to Crete. A few weeks at that little town near the city near the Fair Havens. He probably wasn't allowed to go any further, but he would have heard, and brethren would have come to him there as he was at the Fair Havens, because as we said, he's there a little while, as Acts chapter 7 tells us. And they'd stayed there. He says, seems like too many days. And he says, we've got to go if we're going to go, because we can't stay here. And all the ship people knew that. But so for that little time, the Apostle Paul got a real taste that something needed to be done in Crete. Something needed to be done to get these ecclesias sorted. Nobody'd been there. They'd sort of done it on their own, and they'd sort of struggled along, and with all the cultural issues that they had outside and inside the ecclesia, they really needed to be put together. The ecclesias needed to be set in order. Now, all ecclesias need to be set in order. Apostle Paul said, do all things decently and in order. It wasn't happening there, but it's so vital. It's so important. It's important that our meetings start at the right time. We've got people doing their duties and everybody's ready and fit and know what's expected of them. And that translates into our behaviour in broad terms generally. You know, if we're well dressed, we feel as though we're behaving well. You know, if we're well presented, we feel as though we should present our character to others in the same way. It's all reflection of the things that we think and know and do and that are right within. That will go out and will embrace the environment and the people that we're with. So important. So the Apostle Paul knew he had to start deep down and change these people's method of thinking and an idea of what was right in the service of the Lord Jesus Christ and what God expected of them. Now, as we said, the ancient Philistines, going back to Genesis chapter 10, fantastic. You know, really, I've been having a look at Genesis chapter 10 over a few years now. To look at where people came from, where they went, what affected their character, their development, their expectations, the kind of people they were, the things that they accomplished or didn't accomplish, all has a lot to do with their origins right back under Shem, Ham and Japheth. And as we said, Crete's got part Japheth from early on, Javan, because we're told that Javan actually populated the islands, even right across to Tarshish. The islands of the Mediterranean and right out to Tarshish came from Javan, the Greeks. Largely the islands that are mentioned include Rhodes and others in the area of the sea north of Crete, and also islands across next to Italy. But anyway, that's the Greeks. They sort of did the northern Mediterranean and out to Tarshish. On the other hand, the Egyptians, from the Egyptians, Mitzrayim, who came from Cush, you read here, that Mitzrayim begat Ludim and Anamim and Lehabim and Nephuhim and Pathrusim and Casluhim, out of whom came Philistines and Caphtorim. Now, Crete is well known historically as the island of Caphtor. Also, there were people called Casluhim that lived there, and many of those became the Philistines, and after a period of time they migrated across to, they tried to get back into Egypt, so history tells, but the Egyptians wouldn't have them. Isn't that interesting? The Egyptians didn't want them back, and so they fought them as they came back to try and get into Egypt, and that's why they went across to the Gazan area. It's the same today. The Egyptians don't want the Philistine. and so they settled there. And that was about 2000 BC, about the same time that Abraham was coming down from the north and crossing over the Euphrates. We know that Abraham had dealings with the Philistines, and so did the other fathers. And when Israel came out of Egypt, it appears there were more Philistines there. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk about this. There's a reason why more Philistines came in about 1600 BC after the group that came in 2000 BC. 2000 BC, time of Abraham. 1600 BC, time of Israel coming out of Egypt. There was a huge eruption in the Mediterranean in 1600 BC on the Greek island of Santorini. Anybody heard of Santorini lately? Have you? Have you not? How many thousand earthquakes have they had in Santorini in the last few weeks? Lots of earthquakes. As a matter of fact, I've been watching a chart that's sort of been a moving chart of earthquakes on Santorini. And about every 5 minutes there's at least a 3.0. And there were two last night, getting on towards midnight while I was still up having a look at this study. 5.2 and another one 5.0 or 5.1 thereabouts. These, what they call earthquake swarms, have been happening. And everybody's been leaving the island of Santorini. Now, Santorini's official name is Thera. So if you're looking at history and you look for the eruption of Thera, that's the eruption that took place in about 1600 BC. The biggest, they say, the biggest volcanic eruption in human history. This is what they say. I think there might have been bigger ones before. There's another one that was about the same size, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the Greek island of Santorini now, very dramatically spectacular. Anybody been there? Santorini? Yeah. Dramatically spectacular island with these towering cliffs, which are all volcanic. The black rocks and soil you can see there. That's actually the crater of a volcano, which blew enormously in 1600 BC. So now called the Greek island of Santorini. The white across the top there is the houses of Santorini. Everybody probably recognises the blue and white houses there with the domed roofs. Beautiful island. Very about 20,000 people live there. 3 million people visit it every year. It's chock-a-block with tourists, but not now. More than about 2/3 of the population have left in the last couple of weeks, frightened about what's going on and what's likely to happen. Down the bottom left is an indication of modern houses, but what the original eruption might have looked like. Absolutely incredible. Now, Santorini is, as you can see, they're a horse-shaped island, but once upon a time, before 1600 BC, it was all one island, volcano in the middle. Now, this is just 70 miles from Crete, and when a volcano like that goes up, it affects the countries around it. And there's lots of evidence that when this one blew up, and by the way, as I said, I'll show you in a moment, there's one in Indonesia that went up in about 1815, about the same size as this one. And then there was Krakatoa. Anybody heard of Krakatoa? I think we've all heard of Krakatoa pretty well. Krakatoa went up in about 1883 over in Indonesia. The sound from Krakatoa was heard across the sea 3,000 miles away. They reckon they heard it in Alice Springs from way up northern Indonesia. The sound of it, the boom of it, went so far. And of course, tidal waves and lots of people were killed. Now, when this volcano went up, the civilization on Crete was called the Minoan civilization. Talk a bit more about that in a moment, because the character of the Minoan civilization has kept on down through history through Crete, even though, in a sense, it was devastated through this volcano. But you can see on the map there on the right, the volcano of Santorini, and just around about where those tips are flying off now is where all the current earthquakes are happening. Now, back in the day, when it blew up in 1600 BC, again there was a lot of shaking, a lot of earthquakes leading up to it. And records show that the people got in their boats and left the island, and that's why they can't find much in the way of human remains there. Different to Pompeii. Anybody seen or been near Pompeii and seen the casts of the bodies that were there that were all consumed or in full body shape underneath all the ash that came down and rained down on them? So a lot of people fled the island when they felt all the rumblings happening, and they escaped. Now that's kind of what's happening now. A lot of people think, of course, all the volcanologists and seismologists are all flocking to this island now, with all their instruments out and so on. Who can tell what's going to happen? But they do believe that in the next couple of days, or I did see one report saying in the next couple of days, something is going to happen. Either it's going to blow or maybe it'll die down, but they think it might blow in some way or other, whether it's going to be an earthquake only or the volcano itself. So that caldera there, is the centre of the volcano. This is all the rim of the volcano, which all sank, the centre of the cone of the volcano sank down into what's called the caldera. Sounds a lot like a cauldron to me, bubble, bubble, toil and trouble in the cauldron. That's what's happening underneath there right now. They don't know whether there's liquid there, magma, ready to blow the volcano again. Nobody knows. Of course, these volcanoes are only supposed to go up once every 20,000 years. Just the same as this was only supposed to have a record flood every 100 years. That's about every 20 years. So who can tell what's going to happen there? The interesting thing is that the Minoan civilization was decimated. It's regarded, the Minoan empire, based in Crete and covering all of Greece in those days, was regarded as the first significant empire in history. And most of that was wiped out. Great tidal wave, which they say could have been anywhere from 60 to 100 feet high, came across the tsunami over that island and went right down to Egypt. And in fact, Egypt has got a lot of evidence of volcanic ash from that very volcano. They've worked all that out in Egypt. And some suggest that, and it's an interesting suggestion, some suggest that if it happened around the time of the plagues of Egypt, that the plague of darkness might well have been from a cloud coming over from that volcano. That's a suggestion. It would explain perhaps why there was darkness in Egypt but light in Goshen. The cloud is moving in a certain direction. That's a possibility. A lot of people think that there are links there when you look at different people talking about history of it. Now, it was a very Crete, and this continued on, very proud of their idea that they were the home of the gods. That Crete was the birthplace of the god Zeus, which is the great god of the head god. And that King Minos, the first Minoan king, was a son of Zeus. It had this dreaded Minotaur, which was supposed to keep everybody in check and frighten everybody. Half bull, half man, hidden away in a labyrinth that nobody could get to him, etc. There's a story about how a hero got to him in the finish, but anyway, that's also, he's supposed to have descended somehow or other from the god Zeus. And there are a lot of these sort of mythological ideas that govern their feeling of being important. You know, the Cretans really felt they were important. That nobody else could really talk to them or organise them or overcome them or tell them what to do. It's a bit like our society today. Nobody will tell me what to do. You know, that's so common in society today, isn't it? And this whole culture was there. So how do you organise an ecclesia where everybody thinks that they can do whatever they like? The Apostle Paul says, you've really got to sort this out. Brethren and sisters have to pull together. Things have to work together. Everybody has to know, as I said, what's expected of them and where they should be and what they should be involved in. And that way, that runs smoothly and everybody can be happy. That sort of gets put to the back burner then, and everybody can enjoy one another's company. So we said the Philistines, originally from Egypt, migrated to Crete, from Crete, to Crete first of all, then to the Canaanite coast about 2000 BC, and possibly again about 1600 after the Thera eruption. And one of the gods that was there, not half bull, half man, but half fish, half man, the great half fish god Dagon. And there he is fallen down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. But that's a bit of background there. Now today, as we said, the same mindset, I suppose is a word, continues in Crete today to what was there in the Apostle Paul's day and what had been there for a long time. So you've got this sort of thing which was, which is all with the Greek is supposedly, it's a fiction of course, but it's based on the idea of a man from Crete and the kind of hedonistic lifestyle that is encouraged and indulged in Crete. So, as we said, there's a rural lifestyle, it's a highly productive soil, it's volcanic soil, grapes and olives are the main crops there, which, olives are those sorts of things again that you sort of sit in the cafe on the corner and just throw an olive in, and go on with your board game and chatter away. It's a really lazy kind of lifestyle. And these are the kind of people. So, but if you turn them up the wrong way, very independent, very aggressive, suspicious of authority, very self-confident, very irreverent. Manners are... you wouldn't think about manners. You wouldn't talk about manners. They wouldn't understand manners. This lawless lifestyle. Liars, evil beasts, and slow bellies, and it's true. Now, this map is taken from a story of the Bible. I'm going to just home in on it a little bit more in a moment, but it's a good outline of Brother Mansfield gave his thoughts to where the apostle would have gone after he was released from his imprisonment and on his way to Crete, and what happened after Crete in that window between the first and the second imprisonment of the Apostle Paul. So going to this map that I sort of put together from that, and it's pretty similar to the way Brother Mansfield sees it, to give you an idea of the progress of the Apostle Paul once he leaves Rome. So first of all, what I've done there is in the green, you can see the trip direction of the Apostle Paul eastwards, okay? Having left Rome after the end of his being released from his first imprisonment. I'm going to go through this in some detail shortly. Philippi, down probably through Troas, across to Laodicea to Philemon's home, and then down with Timothy through Jerusalem. That's the first part of the about 4 to 5 years between the first and second imprisonment. Then from Jerusalem with Titus to Crete. Then he goes up to Nicopolis, the Apostle Paul, possibly via Corinth, and he calls on Titus, who he's left there for a shortish period, to come and join him at Nicopolis. They winter there, and they then take ship across to Spain and spend some considerable time probably between Spain and possibly Britain. And then they come back, and that's the yellow. Okay, the yellow is a return from the west. They go to head to Miletus, They don't go to Ephesus, which is nearby, because Paul said, you're never going to see my face again in Acts chapter 20. So he didn't see the Ephesians there, but he would have called the ecclesias from that area around to see him at Ephesus. Then briefly up to Troas. He forgets his coat there. He doesn't bring his coat and parchments there. And he asks Timothy, who's in Ephesus, to come and bring them with him. He goes via Corinth, across to Rome, and then he's captured and imprisoned. I want to go through that in some detail because all this has to do with the kind of things that were going on in the time of the writing of the letter to Titus in Crete, and the kind of character that Titus was. And we see how he could do the work that was needed to be done in Crete by all the events that happened around this time. So let's have a little look at it now. After about 2 years, Paul's imprisoned in Rome, after we know it's 2 whole years, Acts 28 verse 30, and that looks like about AD 60 and 61, around that time, that the Apostle Paul then is released, and he spends about 4 years, it's possibly 5, but about 4 years at least, travelling amongst the ecclesias that were already established, and it was not an urgent thing in the early stages. Right? In the early stages that he had been imprisoned, but he'd been imprisoned because the Jews had laid charges against him. He'd appealed to Rome. There was no real persecution of the Ecclesia at this time. It's not exactly a leisurely trip, the first part in the green, but there's no urgency about it at that point in time. So he travels amongst the ecclesias that are already established. He opens up new fields as well. And according to some historians, and he expected himself, he goes to Spain. Then tradition has it, and there are some legends around it as well. There's nothing in the Bible to tell us, but the legends are that he went to Britain and he preached in Londinium, now London, on Ludgate Hill, the very place that they built St Paul's Cathedral and called it St Paul's Cathedral because traditions are that Paul was there. Then in 64 AD, Nero began persecuting all the Christians. And after the fire of Rome, it appears that he set the fire to make a bit of a hero of himself. He was a nutcase, totally. He was only 17 when he came to the emperorship, and he never ever really got his mind straightened out. And he thought himself a singer and a player on a lyre to accompany himself, positioned himself right near the fire, and sang songs as Rome burned. Incredible situation, that seems to be right. Now, of course, when his people, the senators, turned against him, he found a scapegoat. That was the Christians, the believers, our brothers and sisters. He blamed them, and gradually persecution went throughout Rome and further throughout the empire. Now, when Paul found out about that, and it seems that he was over in the West at that time, possibly in Britain at that time, clearly there's an urgency now. The urgency comes in his movements, in his writings, and what's happening. And he makes some final hurried visits to Western Asia. That's the area of Miletus, around there, and Troas, and Achaia, which is the area of Corinth. He visits Corinth on the way. He comes back to Rome. Nero's persecutions have caused terrible havoc now in the Ecclesia. Many have left the faith. Many have been driven out of the city. Many have turned away from Paul. And Paul's arrested and he faces 2 trials. And the first one, he's at least given some clemency, but he comes back for a second trial and he's told he's going to die. And according to tradition, he's executed by beheading about 67 AD. So it's after being in prison possibly in 66, he dies in 67. So on the eastward journey, he's not yet with Titus. He leaves the prison and he's been in custody there, and Timothy and Epaphras and Aristarchus are also been imprisoned, probably in the kind of house arrest that Paul was in. But it's interesting that there was a movement to some extent against the believers, and they were being singled out. As we said, Nero was in charge at the time. He was a madman. He didn't die until 68 AD, actually. They made him commit suicide and finished. But he's spasmodically lashing out. And you can read, you've got the quotes there in front of you. Hebrews 13 verse 23. Just have a quick look at Hebrews 13, 23, because it's relevant to the fact that it appears that Paul visits Jerusalem. Hebrews 13, 23. And what we're doing here is we're working on the basis and the assumption and understanding, it is backed up by some of the early church historians, that the things that Paul wanted to do and said he was going to do, he actually did. Now we know that Luke, who was with Paul right the way through Rome and all these journeys, Luke is there, but he doesn't tell us, he doesn't write anything after Acts 28, the first imprisonment. At the end of the 2 years, he stops writing. Unfortunately for us, in a sense. But traditions and church writings from the first end of the 100s, second century and into the 3rd century, different ones say that yes, Paul did, and he went, says some of them, to the ends of the earth. As he says himself, the gospel is preached to every nation under heaven. I'll send thee far hence to the Gentiles. So, he sends Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus has come from Ephesus, from Philippi rather. He's been very sick, and Paul sends him back to Philippi while Paul's still in prison, to comfort them and say everything's okay. And Epaphroditus was sick nearly to death, but he's not actually dead. If you see here in Hebrews 13:23, Timothy is actually set at liberty, having been imprisoned, before Paul. Now, Timothy, relatively short period of time, must have been in bonds in Rome when Paul was there the first time. Know ye that our brother Timothy is set at liberty, with whom, if he comes shortly, I will see you. Jerusalem. So he's going to go to Jerusalem with Timothy. So also Epaphras is there in prison, and Aristarchus as well. So Timothy's set at liberty before Paul. Paul sends him ahead to Philippi. Have a look at Philippians chapter 2. Philippians 2 from verse 25. I suppose it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, the companion in labour and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. For he longed after you, because you heard he was sick, and he was nearly sick to death, unto death. But I'll send him over so that I don't have sorrow upon sorrow, and that you're comfortable that he's okay again. I sent him therefore the more carefully. When you see him again, you may rejoice, that I may be less sorrowful. Verse 29. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold him in reputation, because I've sent him for the reason to comfort you. But from verse 19, Paul says, as soon as Timothy's available, I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timotheus shortly unto you, that I also may be of good comfort when I know your state. For I have no man like-minded, all seek their own. And then he says in verse 24, but I trust in the Lord that I also myself shall come shortly. So Timothy is set at liberty. He's sent straight ahead to Philippi. He comes back with a good report. Hebrews 13:23. Paul says, as soon as he's come back, we're going to make our way towards Jerusalem. And then Paul's released, and he goes back to Philippi. And Paul and Timothy then, next they go together to Laodicea. Because in Philemon, if you have a look in Philemon, you probably might remember this verse. Apostle Paul says to Philemon, who's there near Colossae, Hierapolis, Laodicea were three kind of sister cities, all very close together. He's in Laodicea, and he says in verse 22, but with all, this is to Philemon, with all, prepare me also a lodging, For I trust that through your prayers I shall be given unto you. So they travel across, as we said, from Philippi, probably across to Troas, then down through the country to Laodicea. Spend a little time there with Philemon, and that would no doubt include the ecclesias nearby as well. And then with Timothy, they make their way to Jerusalem, the visit that they promised to do. We read in the Hebrews that the Hebrews had compassion for Paul and his bonds. That's in chapter 10, verse 33, and also in chapter 13, verse 2. He talks about having compassion on him and others in their bonds. And he'd written to them, the last comment in Hebrews 13 is, they of Italy salute you. So he's written to them from Jerusalem. He's going to go via Laodicea, pick up Timothy down to Jerusalem. Now, from Jerusalem, he makes his journey to Crete. Timothy's sent off to Ephesus. He's there up until the second epistle is written, 2 Timothy. And Paul goes with Titus to Crete. So they find there these ecclesias that are established in every city, but many issues. Lack of guidance is the issue. As he says in chapter 1, verse 5, I left you in Crete. We read this tonight. I left you in Crete that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city as I had appointed thee. And while he's there, also he calls on Zenas, the lawyer. What sort of a lawyer would he be? He'd be the expert in the Jewish law, wouldn't he? Yeah, expert in the Jewish law. It's not as though he needed a lawyer to deal with the authorities. That kind of lawyer is a person who studies the law. That's what Zenas the lawyer is. So part of the reason for that is, as we already read in the first chapter, but we're going to read later on too, the problem is, especially they of the circumcision, okay, the Judaizers. So he's got another expert in the law. Paul was an expert in the law, but it's a big island, so he's got Zenas there too. And Apollos, what do we know about Apollos? Mighty in the scriptures, you know. Studied the law in Alexandria, which meant that he was a studier, he would be very, very familiar with the Septuagint. So for the Greek speakers, who maybe read their Septuagint on Crete, there's Apollos as well. So you've got a group of brethren here working together in Crete. And Paul says these are the kind of people that are going to help us in Crete. So they go to Crete for a time. Then they were dispatched elsewhere when either Artemis or Tychicus came to Crete. So chapter 3 verse 12 of Titus, you read there 3 verse 12, I'll send Artemis or Tychicus, one or the other, and here they'll come and they'll take over from you, because I want you to come up to Nicopolis, because we've got big things ahead of us later on after winter passes. So he says, I want you to come to Nicopolis because I've determined there to winter. Bring Zenas, the lawyer, and Apollos on their journey diligently. So they were going to leave and go elsewhere. We don't know where they went. But they were going to be replaced with either, as we said, Tychicus or Artemis. And then Titus, having done everything he could to get the Ecclesia on a foundation, no doubt drawn up all their constitutions and, you know, worked out the election of their arranging brethren and so on and so on. All that was sorted, and then he could go on to be with Paul on his great project, which was going to start at Nicopolis. So they would winter there together, Titus and others. Paul, Luke would be there too, and other names I mentioned that would have been with him at the time, because they travelled back with him to Miletus and other places. So he had quite a group there, which was formed together. They worked out which ship they're going to go on, and off to Spain. And this is not a map that I've put together. It's on BibleStudy.org, and the person who drew up this map clearly shows that he understands that when Paul went to Spain, going across the little map down in the corner, he didn't just stay in Spain, but he went up to Britain and back again. So it's quite likely that he did He needn't have gone by sea, because you can see there all the red are the Roman roads. Now that's about 60 years after Paul died, but wherever the Romans went, as soon as they got there, taking over any territory, they built the roads for their military to travel on. So he could well have gone up inland from Spain and crossed over the Channel to Britain. So the roads were constructed quickly to support the military campaigns. Now Julius Caesar had tried to get into Britain in 55 BC and 54 BC, but he failed. But Claudius Caesar invaded successfully in 43 AD, and Paul was there 20 years later. Now, if he went there, it would have been, as I said, fairly much under the control of the Romans, and roads and travel would have been easy if he did indeed go there. As I said, some traditions suggest he spoke on Ludgate Hill, and he is the patron saint of London, if that helps. That's St Paul's Cathedral there. So there are early records which show that Christianity, called Christianity, was well established in Britain in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. British bishops attended the councils during the reigns of Constantine and Constantius. There's not a lot of evidence that they attended the Council of Nicaea, which established the doctrine of the Trinity, but some suggest there were 3 bishops from Britain there out of 33 bishops. So Britain was well represented by the later faith, we'll say, the Christianity. And there would have been the truth there, of course, if the Paul priesthood established for some time before the apostasy took hold. But they didn't agree early on, apparently, with the idea of the Trinity, the people from Britain, but they fell into line after a while, as the Orthodox people do. Now he returns from Spain, or Britain, Spain, and 64 AD, Nero started the persecutions. Paul would have heard of that some months later, possibly close to the winter at the end of 65, and he may well have stayed where he was, not come back in the winter, because it appears he came back by sea. And so he's worried, and he has to travel quickly, and a hurried visit to the Ecclesias in Asia Minor and Achaia, and then to Rome. At least Titus and Luke are with him, as we said, many others. He meets the brethren in Miletus and Troas and the ports, doesn't go inland. He left Trophimus, who had been travelling with them, at Miletum sick. He left his cloak with Carpus as he hurried away, and the books and the parchments, and he writes to Timothy in the 2nd letter and says, please bring them and do your diligence to come before the next winter, because I'm going to be cold, and if you wait till after winter you won't be able to sail anyway. No sailing in the winter time in those ships in those days, except the military vessels, which were oared vessels. They didn't have to worry about sail and wind. So in spite of the dangers, he stops at Corinth. Erastus was sick there. He left him, he just left him. He left him at Corinth to do the work there. He comes to Rome. He finds the Ecclesia in a terrible state. Very few, no big welcome like he got on his first journey, of course, where the brethren all came down from Rome to meet him and conducted him up to Rome. No, the Ecclesia's streets were bare, we might say. And he assesses the situation there. There are some there. Linus is one name that is prominent there, who, according to history, became very prominent in the Ecclesia later on in Rome, Linus, but very few others. And he sends his helpers off to different places, and Titus goes to Dalmatia. And only Luke is with him near the end, he says. Only Luke was close to him. There are a few others there. And he asks Timothy to bring Mark, because he profited for the ministry, John Mark, and his last few days are there. So he says about Dalmatia, this is an area we don't think about much, but that area there, of course, very strongly Eastern Orthodox now. Serbia, Yugoslavia is all that area now. That's Dalmatia. And he says in Romans 15, when you're writing to the Romans, he talks about the fact that he's preached the truth all around to Illyricum. And then, when he sends Titus, he sends him not to Illyricum, but Dalmatia. And that's interestingly historically correct, because just before about middle AD 60s, the name was changed from Illyricum to two regions, Pannonia and Dalmatia. Probably the same place that the Apostle Paul had preached in Illyricum. He sends Titus to Dalmatia. Scripture's true and right and clear, isn't it? All right. Titus is very confident, very bold. I'm not going to get to I'm not even going to get to the salutation.
If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.